All right, I'll get started. My name is Mark Mariano. I'm broadcasting from Darkland in Western Sydney. My pronouns are he and him. I work primarily at a broadcaster, but I'm also a writer for Sweatshop, which is a literacy movement in Western Sydney. And I'm also the editor of an online magazine called The Western, also based in Western Sydney. And yeah, Brooke, there you go.
Hello, Brooke Robinson. I'm a playwright coming to you from Gadigal land, and my pronouns are she and her.
Hi, kia ora. My name's Amon Mara. I am on Te Atiawa land. That's the iwi in the Wellington region of New Zealand, where I am at the moment, and I'm from Christchurch, who the iwi are Ngāi Tahu. I'm a writer and comedian, performer. I had a book come out earlier this year called 2,000 Feet Above Worry Level.
Woo, congrats.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Dan Hogan, and I'm currently living on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people in the Aurora Nation in so-called Sydney. I grew up on Awabakal country, just a little bit south of Newcastle on the north central coast. I'm a writer and I'm a casual primary school teacher. I work in public schools, and I also run a very small independent literary organisation and publisher called Subdim.
Awesome. So I'll get started with the first question. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to have a quick read through them. So this first one is, Australia sometimes likes to refer to itself as a classless society, which anyone in the working class will know to be a myth. What's it like engaging with class within a country that prefers to look away? So Eamon, sorry, I wanted to hear your thoughts, particularly as someone who sits in both worlds, as someone both in knowing the Australian scene and also the New Zealand scene as well, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, I can't pretend to know anything about Australia, but New Zealand has a similar idea of being a classless country, which is just, complete bullshit. Yeah, it's just absolutely ridiculous. There will always be class as long as there's such big inequalities between various groups of people.
Brooke, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on class has changed so much in the last few years. Most of the last 5 years, I've been living in London. And I mean, I have to admit, although I'm from Western Sydney, and I'd never really thought of myself as working class until I went to the UK. Their class problems are much worse than ours, but at least nobody in the UK pretends that it doesn't exist. And it's something that people talk about all the time, and it's really common if you're reading an artist's bio that will be the first kind of sentence. And I really found that quite, had a bit of a minor epiphany living in the UK. And I thought, oh yeah, that's me. And I can say it out loud. It's actually not embarrassing. So yeah, I think I'd really like us to kind of get to that kind of place where at least we can talk about it, Well, that's what we're doing today.
Yay. Dan, I'm curious to hear your side as well, because I think you deal with a very different class in your work. But I think a good question to ask you, or a further question is, are these discussions around class being had in classrooms, or, within younger spaces?
Definitely not. And I think it sort of speaks a little bit back to the original question there about this weird conceptualization that Australia is a classless society. That idea, for some reason, seems to survive in the cultural consciousness, I guess you call it. But when people are pressed to talk about that, oh, what do you mean by it's classless? It's like, oh, I don't know. That's just what we say. That's what we are, aren't we? It's just sort of not a lot of like depth around that. If you bother to, dig right under the very surface. in the classroom, there's absolutely no talk of class at all on any level. I mean, I teach primary school, but I still think you can talk about it. I do. I've been thinking about this. Sort of how that idea of Australia and New Zealand being like this class of society, which is obviously a falsity, but why? What is that? Why is that something that has survived? Like, how does that actually benefit the ruling class? Because often when if you bother to talk to someone about, oh, why do you think that? They're like, oh, I don't really know. And they're not terribly invested in it, I don't think. They just haven't had the time to think about it beyond just replicating what someone else has said, and sort of, imbibing the tone of it, I guess, which is, we'll get on with it. She'll be right. We're classless, whatever, that sort of thing.
It's oh, sorry, Eamon.
Like in the UK, I've never spent any time there, but it seems like, class has such a long history going back to these like lords and ladies, and those people still exist, and they still like inherit these titles and these lands and these huge castles and things, and the ruling class are the people that owned the land, which, and many years ago in Australia and New Zealand, it seemed to be at least possible for a lot of people to own land, and that's just like completely changed in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue into one of the other questions is, do you think our relationship with class has changed for the better over the past 100 years? Or do you think it has evolved into something different, but equally as, fraught or as problematic? I can really only speak, when I think of class and when I think of, the changing nature of class, I approach it as a person of color, and I approach it as a writer of color. And if we look back at the history of Australia and colonization and segregation and things like that, I think, we've come a far way, but there's still so much we can do when it comes to addressing those different layers when it comes to class. But Eamon, so you segued into this question. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how class has changed over the past 100 years, whether it be socially in New Zealand. Like, how has that changed? How has that grown?
Well, I'm definitely not a historian, so I can't pretend to know what class was like 100 years ago. And I think anything that I do know is incredibly whitewashed because Pākehā New Zealand culture is, dominated that discussion. But yeah, of course, it has changed in some ways, and it's probably gone backwards in other ways. I think the thing about like landowning has like massively changed, and I think it was changing for the better, and then got worse again. And the same with like welfare state, where at least people would have access to healthcare and education and those sorts of things, but then it's gone backwards again as well.
Brooke, I wanted to hear about sort of your response, and as someone who has spent a big chunk of time overseas, and then have you made any comparisons in your head, or have you made any sort of natural like conclusions seeing both sides? Or
I mean, I guess I think the frustration here is that I feel like we kind of can't get anywhere until we start talking about it properly, and I guess, as I was saying, I sort of didn't realize that it was a problem until I moved to the UK, and you see how much people talk about it in the UK, and then the gap between us and them in that regard is absolutely enormous. So in that sense, I think we have a really, really long way to go. And, I'm not a historian or an economist, but every time I read a newspaper article that's one of those kind of economics pieces that measures quality of life and living standards and that kind of thing, Australia goes backwards every year in terms of the gap between rich and poor. So I don't mean to be negative, but to me, it seems like we're going backwards, if anything. And yeah, even in the kind of 5 years I was in the UK, I noticed that it was, it was coming up in I mean, maybe it was a particularly fraught time because of Brexit and whatnot, but people were talking about it more and more in those 5 years. So in some ways, I think we're kind of getting further and further behind, unfortunately.
So Mike's just sent through a question. Could you consider talking about the way classes started to be spoken about in writing and media in the past few decades? So when I read that, I think immediately back to, I think it was News Corp that actually did this. They launched a campaign called Fair Go for the West. And it was essentially just an attempt to sort of just balance out the coverage when it came to Western Sydney, a low socioeconomic part of Sydney. And it was essentially, and as someone who lives there and lives and breathes Western Sydney, I thought this was a good turn, but then even with that, and even with those initiatives, I didn't think much changed. You know, media in particular still wanted to focus on the blue collar crime that happens in Western Sydney, but they wouldn't really touch on, you know, the white collar crime that happens, you know, in the eastern suburbs or outside of Western Sydney. So, you know, I wanted to gauge that with you, particularly Dan, as someone who lives in Sydney. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed a shift when it comes to discussing pockets of Sydney?
Oh, yeah.
And just how that's reflective of Greater Australia?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, in terms of the media and the writing around class in that respect, and in a Sydney context, it's interesting. There's this real, like, almost, what's the word? Like, anxiety around even using the two words working class. Unless you're talking about a pocket of Sydney that is usually blue collar workers, usually people of color who have done a blue collar crime, as you described, Mark. That's usually the only, that's in that scenario, the media, it'll use whatever language it wants, that, you know, anything goes. But anything outside of that, you won't hear the word working class or anything that's adjacent to that. Either. Even when you see, so I grew up on the Central Coast, the northern part, and there was this News Corp, I think it was Daily Telegraph, about 4 years ago. Don't quote me on that, but I've seen it done before, where they look at some other, almost seems random pocket of Australia. In this case, it was a suburb I grew up in, San Remo, and they sort of looked at it in comparison to other suburbs in Western Sydney. I don't know if that's just a Daily Telegraph thing. And it was basically just saying, like, oh, here's some poor people that look like they're from Western Sydney, but they're not in Western Sydney. Whoa, crazy. And, you know, here's a photo and a quote. Whoa, you know, this guy said drugs. Whoa. And that's about the extent of, I think, class literacy, if that's the way to put it, in terms of our media. It's quite seedy. Yeah, sorry to ramble on a bit there. No. I have found, one thing I want to say too, like I wrote an op-ed once for, recently, by recent, I mean like the last couple of years, for an outlet I shan't name, a good outlet though, and it's interesting. I'm drilling down onto the minutiae now, but sometimes writing things, I always use the word working class if it's, you know, if it can fit, if it's relevant, but it's always changed to something else by editors. It's always like, for example, I wrote something about education, public education, which has been defunded for the last 10, 20 years, whatever. And I was talking about how that affects working class families, and it was changed to hardworking families. And it's like, what is that? What is that? Yeah.
Yeah, just to further that point, I think it's important to discuss how, you know, media sometimes weaponize the right kind of working class, whether it be tradies or politicians or politics, versus the shameful sort of working class when it comes to crimes. Have you seen something similar like that, Eamon, in New Zealand? Is it a similar narrative there, or is it?
Yeah, I think so. It's like, if someone is Māori or Pacifica and it's a crime story, that is kind of always mentioned, and sometimes it's mentioned through like from this area or from this, like from South Auckland or somewhere like that, and it's often done through like coded language. I think New Zealand, if it talks about working class, it kind of does it proudly. I think often in media and in I think especially in writing is we often put on a like much more like working class sort of voice in our writing. Like the first writer in New Zealand to kind of be credited with writing in the New Zealand voice rather than in kind of in an English voice is Frank Sargison, and like he wrote a lot about rural stuff and like good Kiwi men. But he was a lawyer, like it wasn't really his background, but he kind of put it on, and then that became the New Zealand voice for writing. And I think that's gone on from then. Is like people think that to write in a genuine New Zealand way, you have to kind of put on this voice, which I think is not actually true to most writers that I've been around.
I think it also it comes a cycle of, you know, the concept of eloquent speakers, you know, people with English as their second language. Can they be both? Can they be neither? I think a good example is, you know, as I mentioned before, I'm a writer for Sweatshop, which is a literacy movement and collective in Western Sydney. We were editing a piece that was written by a refugee detailing his experiences in his war-torn home country. And it was riddled with grammatical errors. I flagged this with the leader and the mentor at the time, and he very appropriately humbled me by saying that my criticism came from unchecked ignorance. You know, was this person's story any less beautiful and any less impactful because it wasn't written a certain way? You know, particularly from someone whose English is their second or third language. Like, I think, again, we're coming down to the concept of class, working class, low socioeconomic status. And then there's also layers of culture and you know, having and adopting an Anglo-Saxon mindset, and that being a symbol of success, or Western standards being the symbol for success. So I think that's a really good segue into this next question. Sort of discussing class within the art scene, you know, can also be quite fraught. You know, a lot of writers are poor, but does poor necessarily equate to working class? You know, how do experiences, opportunities, and the resources differ? Brooke, I wanted to, you know, chat with you first about this. You mentioned you were a playwright prominently. What are your thoughts on that, on the presence of class within the arts industry?
I think, I mean, what's been infuriating me lately, and a lot of people I expect, is the way that the Prime Minister and other politicians have discussed the arts rescue package. I mean, a lot of viewers might remember that comment where finally they were going to give money to the arts, but Scott Morrison was very clear to emphasize that it was less about the actors, but more about the tradies who are going to be putting up the sets for the theatre, which is exactly what we were saying. With the assumption is that all actors are middle class and all tradies are working class, and because it suited him at that moment to, you know, look as though he's propping up tradies in the West, because that's you know, a lot of the marginal seats the next election. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that I found that hugely depressing, I have to admit, because yeah, if what if we don't have sets? Does that mean that we don't have anything to offer of value if we can't employ carpenters?
It's really interesting to talk about funding, because I know, Dan, you touched on it quite briefly. We've seen sort of budgeting throughout COVID sort of be quite a bit messy in terms of there's been money going into arts, and then there's also been word of, you know, university courses being cut, but then, you know, that fund is allocated to other courses, and how there's this sort of imbalance now. Dan, I wanted you to open just talk a bit more about, you know, funding in schools and how that affects, and how that ultimately falls under class and class issues.
Oh, absolutely. So I work in primary school, so I can sort of speak to that. But I do preface that with there is defunding across public education, from early education, primary, secondary, and university as well. But I think that the biggest impact, and it has a compound effect, a generational effect, and because that defunding has gone on for so long. So, for example, in a primary school context, especially with the older kids, you start talking about, oh, what would you do as a career? What would you want to be when you grow up? And as a younger child in primary school, it's a bit more innocent, you know. But even then, because of defunding, parents, communities, families, teachers are aware that, and it also goes hand in hand with cuts to the arts as well. It's just not a viable career path. So I guess kids would be not like what's the word, like abruptly put off pursuing something in the arts, but would be steered towards something else, or even just perceiving art as a hobby, not as like, oh, you should, you know, work hard at this and study it and, you know, look at it some more. And, you know, maybe it's something you can do later in life as a career option or whatever. It sort of gets relegated to hobby very quickly because of that lack of resources and lack of career options, which goes hand in hand with defunding education, but also with defunding of arts as well. It's very hard, even, and in high school as well. In my own experience, it was like, even then it was like, oh, well, no, you don't do drama or writing was viewed a bit differently, especially in HSC, because it's like sort of has this prestigious element. But it's interesting that beyond year 12, it's like, oh no, that was just so you could get your UAI or ATAR or whatever. So there's a lot of weird stuff at play there, but it's all very means to an end. Sorry, I don't know if I've given a very good answer to that.
No, I think. Oh, sorry, Eamon. Yeah.
I think a thing about funding, which is just like completely flawed, is like usually to get funding, you need to be like proven in your field, which is really hard to do if you don't have the resources to produce a thing. And like that goes back, like, and also funding applications are like just fucking hard to fill out. Like they're like complicated and there's lots of questions and you have to, you know, make a budget and do all these types of things. And there isn't a lot of support for going through and working with artists to do that. So it's like, if you have connections that can help you with that, if you know lawyers and accountants and people like that who you can check it over with, then they'll get the funding. And if you don't have that, you're much less likely to get it.
You made a really interesting point there, and I'm going to touch on it quite quickly. The concept of connections, and I think it's important to very much just say that people who are in working class or people who are in low socioeconomic status areas, they aren't inherently born with natural connections. I'm not sure if anyone else can speak to that, but there are, you know, those who live outside of those areas and in quite well-off areas whose parents from the get-go are able to supply them with a job, or, you know, just things like that. So I think it's important to take note of that class privilege in a sense when it comes to connections and such like that. Before we move into the next question, I did want to quickly touch on, you know, COVID and the arts industry. COVID-19 really sort of slammed us, to say the least. And, you know, I think a lot can be said there about how people in working class environments, or who are both working class and both in the arts industry, were hit almost the hardest. Eamon, I wanted to actually hear from you in terms of, you know, you mentioned that you do work as a comedian, and that is a very in-person profession. Is that something that was affected deeply by COVID and the layers to that?
Yes, but I will also say that I haven't really been doing much comedy for the last 2 years. So I did have a gig that was cancelled last week. We didn't have any cases in New Zealand, and then suddenly we did, and then so a gig I had got cancelled, and I also had quite a big job for the Comedy Fest teaching comedy that got cancelled. But New Zealand has been very lucky in that we did have this period of like elimination, and fingers crossed we'll be back to that again. And it you could say that New Zealand was the best place to do live performance in the world at that time. We had no social distancing requirements or things like that. You could fit 100 people in a room and that kind of thing. But one way that COVID has really hit New Zealanders, especially working class New Zealanders, is when we went from back to level 2, when students could go back to school again, a whole lot of students didn't go back because their parents lost their jobs and they took up these jobs in supermarkets and other places like that needed workers, and they couldn't just stop that financial aid to their families and go back to school. So there's reports of lots of students not going back to school, and that stumps people for a long time.
Ooh. Hello? Someone's being wrong? Cute. Brooke, I wanted to quickly ask you before we move on. You mentioned, any supplementary funding would often go to, stage staff, etc. I wanted to hear a little bit more about how COVID-19 has affected the physical art space when it comes to shows and giving shows, and how I think, we've seen a lot of art exhibitions as well become digital. I think a good example would be Campbelltown Art Center with their Bleed Biennale. Everything was digital. And I think that encouraged anyone to consume art and to really, experience that. Formerly it used to be something that only, Front Street people used to attend to the gorgeous gallery with wine and cheese. But now it's not. It's become quite an open experience. Has that sort of bled through to your industry, Brooke?
Definitely, yeah. That's such a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's the one thing that I really feel positive about, and feel like the working class will be the biggest beneficiaries of this. I had a play read online a few months ago with a London theatre company, and normally, a theatre company won't read your play, do a reading unless you're there. Normally, I'd have to be able to be in a position to buy a plane ticket to London and go there to have my play read by that company. So if that kind of thing is going to be happening, I think that will be brilliant. And the conversations I've had with a couple of people in the screen industry, they're kind of saying the same thing, that, suddenly you can kind of pitch stuff to people in LA, whereas, normally 6 months ago, they would have expected you to only be able to have that conversation if you can buy a plane ticket and turn up. So yeah, I really hope this continues, and it's a sort of like level of parochialness. If we can leave this pandemic with some of those barriers down, I think that that will be wonderful.
I think it's really interesting, just as we close up this discussion of arts, just the dichotomy of it all in terms of everyone turned to arts the second that the COVID-19 pandemic hit. We started streaming Netflix, we started listening to music, we were doing incredible things, but that isn't shown and that isn't supplemented in policy and in funding and in framework. So I'm really glad that we were able to all have that discussion. And so now we're going to move on to this last question. It's called, so essentially, let's talk slang. So dialect language and languages other than English are an integral part of working class cultures across Australia and the world. But gatekeepers such as publishers, funding bodies, and arts organizations frequently make little to no attempt to engaging with working class writers who refuse to code switch or haven't yet had the opportunity to learn the required lingo. What needs to be done? And if you were running a peak funding body, what would you do? I'm going to ask you guys individually that last question, because I feel like, it's great to hear what everyone has to say. But I do want to talk from again, from a Western Sydney perspective, just that concept of language and that concept of slang. Like people in Western Sydney have adopted certain words and adopted them into our vernacular, and it's like, it's for us, it's a sign of camaraderie. for us, it's a sign of we can identify each other, we can, you know, contribute to this great community. And I think a really good example, I'm not sure if you're across him, he's a drill rapper, his name's Hogan. He has a song called Tell 'em I'm Doing Eatswa. Essentially, it's like, tell them I'm doing sweet, I'm doing fine. And Eatswa has become a word of compassion and a word of great love in our community and in Western Sydney. So, you know, I just wanted to check in, like, Eamon, is there anything similar like to that, or when you're talking about slang when it comes to New Zealand culture and in that society?
Well, like I've personally find that quite hard to talk to from my experience, because like I talk in a very middle class accepted. I talk in the language of the gatekeepers, and that's also like my background generally. But like I feel like that, and that's how I write. But yeah, I feel like I kind of talked about this before. New Zealand writers often do like heighten their like Kiwi slang in writing, and I think sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it does seem a bit forced. But there are some great writers coming through that do speak genuinely from their slang. It's just not me.
I think it's, when we're talking about slang, I think it's also important to talk about generational gaps and just the varying language from class and then also from age. Dan, I wanted to chat to you about that in terms of you're surrounded by a lot of young people, particularly when you're teaching. Is there words there that like are completely different and that you're not like, oh my goodness, am I old for not knowing what that means?
Yeah, I would say every like 6 months or something like that, there's a kid will ask me something, and it's like they're baiting me. They know they're delivering this little morsel, and it's usually wrapped up in language which has been extracted from like a meme or a song or something, some cultural artifact that I'm really not up with, or a video game. Things from Fortnite, I get constantly baited the things from Fortnite, and it's embarrassing. I was at work today actually, and I got baited. I was working at a school. I work in schools in Western Sydney mostly, and that's where my experience has mostly been as well over the years. And it's happened to me twice in the last 3 weeks at two different schools. And I don't know if anyone in this chat can tell me what it means. I've had kids ask me, "Am I an eshe?" I don't know what that is. I don't know. And I'm like, and my answer is always like, I don't know. Why?
Eshe is a term of, it's also a term of endearment. Like you say it sort of like eshe, like it's like a sort of like cool or awesome in a very weird, different way. On the flip side, it could also mean, you know, that you present lab behaviors, bogan behaviors, essentially. But if it was said a certain way, I'm sure it wasn't to offend you or to poke fun. It can be pretty much a loving eshe, like cool, you're awesome. That's pretty much it. That's all I can say particularly.
Thanks, Marcus. That's good to know now.
I wanted to flip this question to Brooke. Do you think writers from working class backgrounds are expected to perform a certain way, or are expected to exclusively write about working class issues, or do you think we're boundless when it comes to future projects?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I certainly noticed in the UK, very much so, it's really clear that what they want from working class writers are, I mean, at the extreme end of the spectrum, it's kind of what we call poverty porn, I guess. Yes, very much so in the UK. Here, maybe less so, but because we don't do many working class plays anyway. I mean, and I can only talk about plays because that's kind of my field. I mean, certainly what does irk me sometimes is, you know, with certain funding applications, you can read between the lines and you know that if you pitch them a middle class play that they won't be interested. You know that what they want from you is, you know, is somewhere on the spectrum towards poverty porn. And if you want to apply for that and you want a chance, then, you know, that's what you've got to kind of pitch. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at the UK, and my observation there was, yeah, I mean, you know, working class plays are a genre.
I can really sort of only approach that question from, you know, a broadcasting perspective. We, in the past few years, we've seen shows like Housos or Fat Pizza or Struggle Street or Here Comes the Habibs, and you know, they revolve around low socioeconomic areas or families. And I wanted to pose potentially this question to Dan. Would you consider those shows poverty porn, or would you see them as representation or necessary representation?
I think it's not as binary as that. I think it can be both, and I think it's sort of I think if the people who are being represented in those are the producers of those things, I think. I mean, that's it. I mean, that doesn't always mean authenticity, but it does mean that it's been presented at least by, there's something more interesting in that, I think, than, you know, as Brooke was describing, like someone who has no skin in the game being like, oh, here's this thing over there that I don't know, want to monetize or whatever. But yeah, I think, yeah, sort of, I think you're looking at those programs that you just listed there, Mark. I think it'd be interesting to see how they hold up, how communities feel about those, because I think they're not static either. Like at the time they were, you know, broadcast for the first time, even those communities or whoever viewers generally might have felt, oh, this is great. But then, you know, that doesn't mean that they will feel that way in 5 or 10 years time. There might be a period where it's like, I don't like that. And then it might be good again. I don't know. I'm describing this very, very vaguely, but I think it can be both. But I think what is interesting is that it is a record of something, and it doesn't. It's a record of something. But what you can see on the screen isn't necessarily like, you know, the start and end place of some kind of historical record or like a, you know, a cultural artifice. It's everything else that orbits around that, the way it's perceived. You know, the way people consume it or didn't consume it, the commentary around it, how people responded or didn't respond. Yeah, it's bigger than just the product, to put it in a word.
Listen, I really want to touch on Struggle Street. I'm not sure if you guys watched the show or had heard about the show. It's essentially like a documentary style show. I see you sort of reacting a little bit to hear about it. It was essentially it was a documentary series released by a broadcaster, and they focused on sort of low socioeconomic areas within Australia, talking about you know the different stereotypes that come to that. Are they real stereotypes? Are they not stereotypes? And yeah, the first season of Struggle Street was based on Mount Druitt, and I live very closely to Mount Druitt. The way that it was marketed and the way that it was portrayed, it did, you know, place a bad light on the area. But then when I actually watched the series and when you delve into the intricacies of it, it was actually quite beautiful. So I think it does come down, like you said, it does come down to who's actually handling this project, who, you know, are the relevant people being involved and are they being consulted? And I think this is potentially a good segue into our final question. If you had the power, how do you think people with power in the industry can better support working class writers? Or if you were in a peak funding body, what would you do? So I want to ask Eamon first.
Was that me? Sorry, I cut out.
Yes, Eamon, yes.
Yeah, great. The answer is more money and a sustainable career. You're not going to get people who are struggling to survive going to put all of their effort into becoming something which is like has no chance of paying the bills. Like in New Zealand, you generally most people who publish books come through the master's programs, and no one in the master's program does it without having money in as a backup. Like, I worked through mine for a bit, and then I had these savings which I used, but I still my mum gave me $1,000 a month before it finished because I needed it to survive. And so it's not possible to do things like that if you don't have money supporting you. So more money, give it to people earlier in their careers, and have a way that can lead to sustainable work from then on.
Brooke, your thoughts?
I would just say collect the data. I mean, I can't think of a certain funding application or application to any program at any theatre company in this country where it's been part of the demographics. But that is normal now in the UK, that there will be a class question when you're applying for things. So, yeah, I'd love to see that on forms here.
Awesome. Dan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely echo what Brooke and Amon have both said. And I also, to add to that, I guess people who have power in the industry already, I think they could simply better support working class writers by improving their own literacy around class. To circle back to what we're saying at the start of the conversation, I think a lot of funding bodies or people who have power in the industry, to put it broadly, are sort of don't know how to approach it because they just don't have the literacy. They haven't done the reading, so to speak. They haven't done the self-education. And they're in a position with an amount of privilege that really does afford them the time and space for that self-education. So there's kind of no excuses for that. But I think that self-education, I think, will give them ideas to how they can better service and help and support working class writers. But before they have that literacy, they need that first, I think.
I think to piggyback on all those points, I'd personally add that the organization do the research. I think, a big part of that would be identifying, grassroots art organizations or individuals, and really fund these communities or working class communities right at their pulse, as opposed to adopting the narrative. I think it's just about giving the platform where it's needed and passing on the mic to where it's appropriate and where it's relevant. Awesome. So to wrap up, I just wanted to check whether anyone had any points they wanted to add to anything that we've discussed today.
No, not really.
No, I'm good.
Oh, good. It was so fun chatting to you guys. That was so cute.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah.
No trouble. Awesome. So Isabel, we're ready. We'll wrap up, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.